Okay, so today we're going to talk about Chapter 18, which is the first part of the cardiovascular system, specifically dealing with the heart. So let's just get right into the video. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be talking about the heart today, and more specifically, the anatomy of the heart, how blood flows through the heart, the physiology of the heart, and so on. So when you're thinking of the heart, you want to understand that there are two circuits that are associated with the heart. We have the circuit that's going to send blood from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart, pulmonary circuit. And then we're going to have blood flowing from the heart to the rest of the body, which is what we call the systemic circuit. So the right side of the heart is going to receive blood that is low in oxygen. That blood would have already flowed through our system and is going to be sent back to the heart so that we can get rid of CO2 that's now more concentrated in our blood and pick up more O2. And the left side of the heart, so the right side of the heart is what we are going to call the pulmonary circuit side, because that blood that's low in oxygen is going to flow from the heart to the lungs and back into the heart. The left side of the heart is going to receive blood that's going to be now rich in oxygen because it's come from the lungs back into the heart, and that blood is going to flow through the rest of our body, which is what we call the systemic circuit. Now, in terms of what the different chambers of the heart are called and what they do, we are mammals. We are grouped under that category, and so we have a four-chambered heart. We have two atria and two ventricles. So the atria, we have a right and a left one. The right atrium is going to receive blood returning from the systemic circuit, and the left atrium is going to receive blood returning from the lungs. Now we have two pumping chambers as well, and those two pumping chambers we are going to call the right and the left ventricles. So the right ventricle is going to pump blood to the pulmonary circuit, to the lungs, and then the left ventricle is going to pump blood to the systemic circuit. So we have this diagram right here showing the two circuits and how they work together in relation to the heart and the lungs and the rest of the body. So as you can see, deoxygenated blood is going to be represented in blue because that's just how we represent it. I always think about a person who can't breathe and their skin color will take on a bluish tint. So let's start on the right side, the systemic circuit. So actually, no, let's start on the left side because it'll make a little bit more sense. So we have deoxygenated blood that's going to be carried back to the heart so that we can drop off CO2 and pick up more oxygen. So that oxygen low blood or oxygen poor blood is going to flow from our systems, and it's going to flow back into the heart, being received by the right atrium. So then that blood will flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle and then flow through the pulmonary circuit, because we're going to travel to the lungs to pick up oxygen, drop off CO2. Now we have oxygen-rich blood, which we see right here flowing from the pulmonary circuit, and it will enter back into the heart in the left atrium. That oxygen-rich blood will flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle and then out through the systemic circuit, so that that oxygen-rich blood can now travel to our tissues and cells so that we can use them for our chemical processes that occur within our cells. Okay, so in terms of the approximate size, location, and the orientation of the heart, our heart is about the size of our fist, give or take. And it weighs less than a pound. And in terms of the location of the heart in our thoracic cavity, remember that the heart is going to be located in the pericardial cavity that's located in the mediastinum, so that middle area between the two pleural cavities. We find the heart situated toward the left side of our thoracic cavity, and it's going to sit superior to the diaphragm. So here we have a diagram showing us the location of the heart in the mediastinum. So like I said before, it's going to sit between the two pleural cavities if we had them drawn to scale, and it's going to be situated closer to the left side of our body. Here we have a transverse section of the heart in the pericardial cavity right here, located in the mediastinum between the two pleural cavities. Okay, so we see that the base of the heart is going to lean toward the right shoulder. The apex of the heart, which is going to be the tip of the heart, is going to lean toward the left hip. And then we have the apical impulse that if palpated, it'll be between the 5th and 6th ribs, just below the left nipple, just to give you a more accurate location of the heart. I'm not going to test you on that detail of information, but I definitely want you to know where it's located and, of course, the cavity that's going to protect it. Remember from A&P1 that, like I said before, the heart is going to be located in the pericardial cavity. And remember, any type of body cavity that's going to protect the lungs is going to also have 2 layers of serous membranes. Remember that those serous membranes for the heart specifically, we are going to refer to them as the pericardium. And so the parietal layer is going to be the layer of serous membranes that's going to line the pericardial cavity, and then the visceral layer is going to be the actual surface, the external surface of the heart. So the visceral layer of the heart, we can refer to it as the visceral pericardium, but we can also refer to it as the epicardium, since it's that outer layer, that first layer of the heart. And remember, the purpose of body cavities for our viscera or our delicate organs is to provide protection, and the serous membranes are going to be there to reduce friction between the body cavity and the organ. So in this diagram here, we see our heart, and if we were to blow up this section of the heart right here, we get to see the details of the heart. So here we find the pericardial cavity. Here is going to be the parietal layer of the pericardium, and then we find the epicardium here, or the visceral pericardium right here. The myocardium is going to be the muscular layer of the heart, and the endocardium is going to be that inner layer of the heart that we see. And then this portion of the heart is going to be entering into the heart chamber, more specifically the left atrium. Notice that the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium are going to collectively make up the heart wall. Okay, as always with the homeostatic imbalances, I'm not going to go into them in detail because of timing, but I definitely would like for you to read over them and understand them, because I will ask you those questions on future tests. Okay, so like we just talked about, the layers of the heart wall are going to include the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. Remember that the epicardium is going to be the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. The myocardium is going to be the muscular portion of the heart. And the myocardium is going to be composed of cardiac muscle cells. Obviously, we're dealing with the heart. The cardiac skeleton is going to be composed of this crisscrossing interlayer of connective tissue. And we see that circular and spiral arrangement of the cardiac muscle bundles that are going to make up the myocardium. The endocardium is going to be the innermost layer of the heart wall, and it's continuous with endothelial lining of blood vessels. So remember, actually we'll get to that in the next chapter, more specifically the endothelium and how that makes up our blood vessels. That structure is very similar to the structure of the endocardium. All right, so let's get into some internal features associated with the heart. So like we mentioned before, the heart is going to be composed of 4 atria, 4 chambers. We have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. The atria are going to sit superior to the ventricles, And then we have a couple of septum. So we have the interatrial septum. This is going to be that line or that septum that's going to divide the two atria. And then we have the interventricular septum. That's going to be that line that will divide the two ventricles. So here is by far one of my favorite pictures in anatomy and physiology. I think it's just perfection. It's just gorgeous. So here we have a diagram showing us the gross anatomy of the heart. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on this diagram showing you the four chambers, the valves that are associated with the heart. I lost my train of thought for a moment, and how blood flows through it. I think it's always easier to understand that process when you're actually looking at a diagram of the heart. And after I'm done that, I'll be skipping through tons and tons of slides because I'm just going to cover all of that right here. If you are following along with your PowerPoints, feel free to look at the verbiage as I'm talking about it, especially if that helps you to understand it. So here we go. First, let's look at some anatomical features of the heart, and then we'll go into the physiology of blood flow through the heart. So number one, we're going to start off by talking about our two largest blood vessels that we have in our body. The first being the vena cava, which is this large blue structure right here. So we have the superior vena cava and the inferior portion. It's one large blood vessel, but we divide it into two parts because the superior vena cava is going to collect oxygen poor blood from the upper portion of our bodies, and the inferior is going to collect oxygen poor blood from the lower portion of our bodies. Okay, then we go into the aorta. So we have this large blood vessel here that's going to deliver oxygen-rich blood to the systemic circuit, which is the rest of our body. Okay, now let's get into the actual chambers of the heart, and then we'll talk about some valves. So here we have the right atrium, and the left atrium. The interatrial septum is not shown clearly here, but it's going to be a line behind this pulmonary trunk that's going to divide the two atria from each other. The interventricular septum is going to be this structure right here because it's going to divide the two ventricles from each other. Here we have our right ventricle, and here we have our left ventricle. Let's talk about our ventricles a little bit. So upon looking at them, just off looking at them, you might think that the right ventricle is larger than the left ventricle in terms of the volume of blood that it can hold. And that's not true. Both ventricles can hold the same volume of blood. The difference is the left ventricle is going to be much more muscular than the right ventricle. Why do you think that is? I will tell you. The left ventricle has to be strong enough to pump all of this oxygen-rich blood up and through the aorta and out to the systemic circuit. And so what we see here is that the left ventricle, where's my mouse? The left ventricle has to exert enough force to pump all of this blood up and against gravity so that we can flow up through this large blood vessel here. Whereas the right ventricle, when it pumps blood through the pulmonary trunk that we see here, it's got to go up against gravity a little bit, but not as much. So the left ventricle is going to be much more muscular than the right ventricle. And in another structural thing that we can see is that the left ventricle, in terms of its shape, is a little more rounded. The right ventricle has more of that V-like shape to it. So those are a couple of features that I do want you to know, some differences that I do want you to know about the ventricles. But remember, the ventricles do hold the same volume of blood. That does not change. Okay, let's get into some valves. So we notice that we have 4 valves associated with the heart. We have 2 atrioventricular valves, and these valves, when I think of atrioventricular, they make sense because these valves are between or separate the atria from the ventricles, atrioventricular. So the atrioventricular valve that's going to separate the right and the right atria and ventricle is going to be the tricuspid valve. And I have a diagram showing us later on why it's called the tricuspid valve. When you look at it, you can't see it in this picture here, but when you look at the tricuspid valve, it has 3 cusps. So it looks like if you drew a circle and then divided it into the peace sign, that's what this cusp looks like. So that's why we call it a tricuspid valve. And the atrioventricular valve that separates the left atrium from the left ventricle is what we call the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. I typically say bicuspid valve. And that's because this valve only has 2 cusps. So imagine drawing a circle and just drawing a line down the middle. You're dividing it into 2 cusps. Then we have 2 semilunar valves. So these semilunar valves are going to separate the ventricles from blood vessels. So the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is the one that we see here, is going to divide the right ventricle from this pulmonary trunk, this large vessel that we see here, blood vessel. And the aortic semilunar valve is going to separate the left ventricle from the aorta. So 4 valves that are going to all work together to keep blood flowing in one direction. We do not ever want a backflow of blood. So we always want blood entering the right atrium, flowing through to the right ventricle, flowing through the pulmonary semilunar valve, through the pulmonary trunk, through the left atrium, bicuspid valve, left ventricle, aortic semilunar valve, and out. That is how we want blood to flow. We never want blood to flow from right atrium to right ventricle back to the right atrium. Whenever there's a backflow of blood because a valve does not properly close when necessary, that's what we call a heart murmur. And of course, we don't want that to ever occur. So the purpose of valves in the heart is to keep blood flowing in one direction. Excuse me. Some other structural parts of the heart that I want to point out. We have this fossa ovalis. This is going to be a, when I say a hole, not literally a hole, but it's going to be, well, it is a hole, but I don't mean it in a deficit type of way. It's going to be the entry point for oxygen poor blood that is circulating actually through the heart to enter the right atrium, because all oxygen poor blood enters the heart into the right atrium. And remember, although the heart functions to pump blood throughout the rest of the body, the heart itself needs blood too. It needs that oxygen and nutrients and things like that. So the fossa ovalis is going to be the exit point where that oxygen poor blood that actually circulates through the heart can enter into the right atrium and then through the heart. Okay, what else is it that I want to point out? I think that's all that I want to point out. Yep, that's it. So now let's get into actual blood flow through the heart. Now remember, when you are listening to a heartbeat, we hear 2 sounds. What are they? Lub dub, right? So when you hear lub dub, we're talking about contractions of the heart. And we'll talk about the cardiac cycle later on in the chapter and get more detailed into it. But for now, when we're talking about the atria contracting and the ventricles contracting, they both contract together. So when the atria contract, those 2 atria contract together, and when the ventricles contract, they contract together. Of course, blood's going to be flowing in opposite directions. So for instance, when the right atrium is filling with blood, the left atrium is filling with blood. And then when it's time for those 2 atria to contract and send that blood to the 2 ventricles, they will contract together. Because if the right atrium contracted, then the right ventricle contracted, then the left side of the heart, we'd have 4 heartbeats, like 4 heart sounds in a cardiac cycle, and we don't, we just have 2. So when I'm talking about blood flow through the heart, I'm going to break it apart as in it looking like blood's going to go from right atrium, right ventricle, then left atrium, left ventricle. But keep this in mind that both atria will contract together, both ventricles will contract together. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so let's go. So like I said, deoxygenated blood, oxygen poor blood, is going to enter from the systemic circuit back into the heart through the superior and the inferior vena cava into the right atrium, okay? Now, as the right atrium is filling with blood, this tricuspid valve that we see here is going to be pretty much closed, but it will have a slight gap in it to where blood will start to trickle into the right ventricle, okay? When the right atrium is full with blood, this tricuspid valve will open up all the way, and the right atrium will contract to fully push the remaining blood in the right atrium into the right ventricle, okay? Now, when the right ventricle is starting to fill with blood, or after the right atrium has contracted and now the right ventricle is full with blood, this tricuspid valve will close. Now, let me back up. When the right atrium contracts to push open the tricuspid valve, this pulmonary semilunar valve is going to be closed because we're not ready to send that blood through the pulmonary trunk. So right atrium fills with blood, or is filling with blood. This tricuspid valve is closed for the most part. It's slightly open so we can have like just a very small trickle of blood into the right atrium, the right ventricle. Then when the right atrium contracts and is ready to propel blood from the right atrium into the right ventricle, the pressure from the right atrium contracting pushes open the tricuspid valve, the right ventricle starts to fill with blood, and this pulmonary semilunar valve is closed. Now, when the right ventricle is full with blood and it contracts, it's going to push against this pulmonary semilunar valve and push it open, and blood will flow through this pulmonary trunk that we see right here, and then through the left and the right pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Now, in most cases, whenever we see an artery in the body, we see it represented by the color red because it's showing us that this blood vessel is carrying oxygen-rich blood. But remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So because these two arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, although they are oxygen poor, it's going to be called an artery. It's not going to be called a vein. Okay, so blood's going to leave the heart through the right and left pulmonary arteries, and blood will go to the lungs, drop off CO2, pick up oxygen, okay? Now, this oxygen-rich blood is going to enter back into the heart through the left and the right pulmonary veins, because remember, veins are going to carry blood to the heart. And it's going to enter and collect into the heart through the left atrium. Now, as the left atrium is filling with blood, the same thing is occurring on the left side that occurred on the right side. This bicuspid valve now is going to be closed for the most part, slightly open so that blood can start to trickle into the left ventricle. And when the left atrium gets full, that pressure will push on the bicuspid valve, completely open it up, and the left ventricle will fill with blood. Remember that when the left ventricle is filling with blood, this aortic semilunar valve is going to be closed. And then when the left ventricle contracts and is ready to propel blood through the aorta, the aortic semilunar valve will open up. The pressure from the left ventricle will push on this valve and open it up. And then blood will flow through the aorta and then out through and to the systemic circuit. Now remember, when the two ventricles contract and they are going to open up their semilunar valves, I forgot to mention this, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves will close, because remember, we don't want blood to backflow. We want to keep blood flowing in one direction. So when blood is going to leave the right atrium, flow through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, and then when blood goes to flow through this pulmonary semilunar valve, the tricuspid valve will close. And same thing occurring with the bicuspid valve. And that's it in a nutshell. Right? Pretty easy, right? You do want to know in detail blood flow through the heart. You will see a lot of questions from this section asking you step by step of blood flow through the heart. So if this doesn't make sense, definitely watch this video again or send me a message and I can try to explain it to you one-on-one. Once you start going through the process of it and kind of playing around with it and reading it, it does tend to make sense and you're able to start to connect it together. Initially, it might be a little overwhelming, but there's a flow to it. And once you start to memorize it, it tends to make a lot of sense. Okay. Here is this. So this was obviously the anterior side of the heart. And of course, this was a frontal section of the heart so that we could see internally. This is going to be the posterior side of the heart. And a couple of things that we want to, or that I want to point out is the coronary sulcus. This is going to be a groove that we find along the anterior ventricular portion of the heart. So the coronary sulcus is going to be right around here. This groove that we see right here. Okay, and then I think that's it that I want to point out right now in this diagram. We'll see this diagram again later on. Okay, so let me just speed on past all of this. These are a couple of pictures of what a heart actually looks like that's been preserved. You'll probably see this in lab as well. All right. Here we have the diagram showing us what the tricuspid and bicuspid valves look like. So as I was trying to describe earlier, this is going to be the tricuspid valve. So like I said before, imagine a circle with the peace sign drawn in it, and you can see that there are 3 cusps. And then this is what the bicuspid valve looks like. It only has 2 cusps. And then these are what the pulmonary and the aortic semilunar valves looks like. So this is the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve here. So these are the 2 semilunar valves that are going to separate the ventricles from blood vessels. And then the atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid valve and bicuspid valves, remember they separate the atria from the ventricles. Okay. I'm skipping through all of this because I've already talked about this. So we're just going to keep on going. All right. All right, the coronary circulation. So this circulation, anytime you hear this term, think of blood flow actually through the heart and for the heart, not blood flow through the heart for the systemic circuit, okay? So this is the blood that is supplied to the heart so that the heart can actually be viable and work. So this is the functional blood supply to the heart itself. It is the shortest circuit of blood flow in the body because the heart is but the size of your fist. So, you know, thinking of blood flowing through a structure this big, it's pretty small. This is going to be delivered. This type of blood flow will occur to the heart when the heart is relaxed, so in between contracting, and the left ventricle will receive most of the blood supply from this circuit. So, coronary arteries. There are both a left and a right set of these arteries, and they arise from the base of the aorta and supply arterial blood to the heart. They both encircle the heart and the coronary sulcus. So remember that groove I just showed you on the previous diagram. We'll see it again. They are branching of arteries that will vary among individuals. So basically the branching of this systemic circuit is going to vary based on different people. And the heart receives about 1/20 of the blood of the body's total blood supply. So the left coronary artery is going to supply blood to the interventricular septum, the anterior ventricular walls, the left atrium, and then the posterior wall of the left ventricles. And it has 2 branches, the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. And then the right coronary artery is going to supply blood to the right atrium and most of the right ventricle, and it has two branches as well, the right marginal artery and then the posterior interventricular artery. So here we see a diagram of the circulation, and here we have the right and the left coronary artery, and then the two branches of the right artery is going to be the right marginal artery and then the posterior interventricular artery. And then the two branches of the left major artery that we see here is going to be the circumflex artery that we see right here and the anterior interventricular artery. So remember, these are the major arteries that are going to supply oxygen-rich blood to the heart itself. The coronary veins are going to include the cardiac veins that are going to collect blood from the capillary beds of the heart, and then the sinus is going to empty blood into the right atrium. So the coronary sinus is going to occur right here, and so it's going to collect all of the oxygen poor blood from the heart and empty it into the right atrium through the fossa ovalis. And then here we have the great cardiac vein that's going to be one of the larger veins of the coronary circulation. And then we have the anterior cardiac veins, the small cardiac veins, and then the middle cardiac veins. The great vein is going to receive oxygen poor blood from the anterior interventricular sulcus. The middle vein is going to receive blood from the posterior interventricular sulcus, and then the small vein will receive blood from the inferior margin. In terms of the blood supply to the heart, I do want you to know the major arteries and veins that we just talked about and where they either send blood to or receive blood from. And that's the extent of that. I'm not going to go into too much detail outside of that in terms of the blood flow to and from the heart itself for the heart. Of course, I definitely want you to study this in your own time because we will talk about that, or I will test you that on the exam. Okay, moving on to cardiac muscle fibers. Remember that cardiac muscle fibers are going to be striated. So we talked about this in AMP1. They're striated. Cardiac muscle cells are going to be branched. They're going to include one nucleus per cell, and they're going to contain these very unique structures called intercalated discs. Remember that the intercalated discs are going to function in connecting cardiac cells together and also distributing the electrical impulse that will radiate through the heart so that the heart can contract together and collectively. The intercalated discs are going to specifically contain two types of junctions that are going to hold these cells together and allow the cells to communicate so that the cells can contract together. So here we have a diagram showing us what these muscle cells look like, just as a reminder. So like I said before, they're striated, so they look like they're stripes. The intercalated discs look like these zip-like structures that we see here. And then we see one nucleus per cell. We don't see the branch structures too much in this slide. Well, you can see it a little bit right here. So here we see it branched right here. The two types of junctions that are going to make up the intercalated disc are going to be desmosomes. Remember, these are the types of junctions that allow cells, that will hold cells together, but also allow them to twist and turn, but still keep them together. And then remember that gap junctions are going to be another type of cell junction that will hold cells together. But in this case, they will also allow them to communicate since gap junctions are open-ended on both sides, it allows one cell to pass information or nutrients or ions to the other cell. So in this case, the gap junctions are going to allow the cells to transmit the impulse from one cell to another that will tell the cells to contract so the whole heart can contract together. Here's another diagram of cardiac muscle cells in terms of its anatomy and its structure. Okay, in terms of how the physiology of the skeletal muscle cell and the cardiac muscle cell differ, some similarities between skeletal muscle cells and cardiocytes are going to be that muscle contraction is preceded by depolarization of an action potential. So let's remember this from 168. So remember that to depolarize the cell membrane when we're trying to generate an action potential, we need to have an influx of sodium ions flowing into our sodium gated channels, and we need to have a an electrical gradient that's going to decrease to zero so that we can depolarize that cell membrane and generate an action potential. Remember that for when the cell membrane does depolarize, the ions are gonna, or this wave of action potential is gonna travel down T tubules that we find associated with our skeletal muscles and our cardiocytes. It causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, and then calcium is going to bind to troponin, causing the filaments of myosin and actin to slide and causing skeletal muscle and cardiocyte contraction. Now, some differences between these two types of cells is that the cardiac muscle cells are going to be excited on their own. And we call this process automasticity, meaning that when the heart generates an action potential, it does so on its own. It doesn't need the nervous system to generate the action potential to then tell the heart to contract. So we have two types of myocytes or muscle cells. We have contractile cells, and then we have pacemaker cells. The contractile cells are going to be the cells that are responsible for the heart contracting itself. And then the pacemaker cells are non-contractile cells that are going to spontaneously depolarize, meaning that our pacemaker cells are going to be the ones that are going to perform this property of automasticity and generate these action potentials that will then travel through the heart. And once they get to the contractile cells of the heart will actually cause the contracting of the heart. So the heart contracts as a unit. So all cardiomyocytes contract as a unit, meaning that they're either going to contract together or they don't contract at all. And this is obviously beneficial to us so that we don't have this palpitation of our heart of these random and sporadic contractions of the heart. An influx of calcium from the extracellular fluid will trigger calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's another difference that we see in cardiac muscle versus skeletal muscle. And then the extracellular calcium will then cause the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the heart to release more calcium. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip through this part because I'm not going to test you on these details of the differences between these two types of muscle. I more so wanted to focus on the property of automasticity. You can definitely read this in your own time, especially if it's of interest to you, but I'm not going to go into that much detail of it, which is why I'm not going to talk about it. But this is just part one of this chapter, so you can click on the next video so that we can wrap up this chapter as well. But definitely let me know if you need more clarification on anything that we've talked about today. I definitely don't mind helping you understand this information. Thank you for watching, and I will hopefully see you in the next video.